This is Modern Political Philosophy for the last week of class. And what I'm going to do in these recorded comments is to finish up with our discussion of Marx from yesterday and take a broad view of Nietzsche's contribution to the development of modern thought and his, and then in some ways the relative place of Marx and Nietzsche as the sort of the final playing out or the outcomes of the premises of modern thought. And as we'll see, by the way, that question's not over by any means. But to finish up with Marx, what I ended in class with yesterday is Marx's social science, an economic critique of capitalism, isn't just meant to be a philosopher's opinion. It's an attempt at in Marx's own understanding of a scientific view of human history and of the unfolding of capitalism, and therefore, like all science, there is a certain sense in which it has to match the reality that it desires to elucidate and render intelligible. And so, and then in particular, since Marx's social science just doesn't attempt to describe and reveal the dynamics of human society and consciousness and the nature of the system in front of us, which it claims to do, of course, the particular role of prediction in Marx is critical, because in some ways the test of whether Marx's principles are true and necessary for understanding the world around us is do they in fact describe the historical unfolding of capitalism, because that's exactly what he claimed to be able to do and should be able to do if his system is true. And so on this question of the scientific status of Marxist thought, or which is another way of saying, is it still true, or was it ever true? Remember, a thinker, a philosopher, can get part of reality right. I think all of the great philosophers that we've considered this semester get part of reality right, even if they have an agenda in restating reality. You have to presume that I don't know if any mind, any human mind could render the human condition intelligible. Even Dr. Dunn, if you give him enough time, like 6 million monkeys typing 6 million typewriters can produce Shakespeare. That might explain Dr. Dunn as, I'm just kidding. So, but you have to see that these great minds certainly they must have grasped some aspect of the human condition. So, but the question for Marx isn't just whether some of Marx's teaching is true or some of it accords with reality, but rather, is it decisively true? And that's a different question. And as I was discussing in class yesterday, the question of the scientific status of Marx's system and its ability, therefore, to analyze and predict the future of capitalism and the outcome of capitalism depends upon it being the scientific system it claimed. Now, what did that claim to science rest upon? What took it out of Marx's individual thought and observation and confirmed it as a scientific description of reality, so much so that you can say this is the truth about the human condition? There are really two elements to it. It's the historical dialectic is the one foundation, and in the main thrust of Marx's thought, this is what put his socialism in a different category than all the other romantic or sentimental socialisms, because it was locked into the dynamic laws of history, and therefore in predicting the eventual self-destruction of capitalism and its transformation into socialism, Marx claims this is simply the science of history speaking. The other element of its scientific character comes from Capital, which we didn't read, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and that's the labor theory of value and how central that is to Marx's overall economics as an economic tool of analysis. So let's talk about the historical dialectic. Is the historical dialectic true? Do societies really obey this? Is this the best way to understand political struggles in the past and the dynamics of human society now? And in some ways, the way I try to shape that question as a political thinker who studies Marx, as we have done this semester, in with a bevy of other thinkers, and looks at different orientations. Well, remember, Marx is a modern, and what that means is he follows Machiavelli and Hobbes and Locke and all the other assertions that politics is not the natural activity of human beings, that human beings are not the social or political animal as the ancients did. So on one level, this question about the predictability of Marx's framework in the end of capitalism, and whether capitalism must, by definition and contradiction, internal contradiction, destroy itself and convert itself into socialism, this is more a question of what kind of framework the dialectic is. And here's what I started to discuss in class yesterday, and this is what I think is decisive. For Marx, since man's being is essentially a material process determined by forces that human beings are not in control of, again, he doesn't think it's an issue of freedom or discretion whether or not socialism is going to be produced. He says this is an iron law of history. We can't change it. Now, you could say, well, then why write a party manifesto which calls for activism to bring on the last revolution when that's going to happen anyway? That's an interesting tension within Marx's thought. But you could still say, well, it makes a certain sense given that in this transitional phase of the collapse of capitalism and the establishment of socialism, that in this second stage of politics, the dictatorship of the proletariat, that there is a role for political and theoretical guidance. It's not as if Marx just thinks that all you have to do is sit around and wait for history to happen. No, there has to be an active revolution to push the self-destructive and determined forces of capitalism into revolution. But generally speaking, the more central question I wanted to raise is Marx looks at society and obviously sees things that anyone else can see. It's a mess. It's a conflict of interest. Politics has always been a kind of clash of interest, and you need Machiavelli to tell you that, or Hobbes, or even Marx. So on one level, the tensions in society and the different self-interests of its elements have always been the object of philosophical speculation, going back to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and Cicero, and including all the philosophers in this group. So on one level, what's novel to Marx is to turn those contending interests and conflicts in society into a different kind of dialectic, into a different kind of dynamic, by calling it them contradictions. Remember, the dialectical is a contradictory form of thinking in social and political evolution. It only works by the clash of contrary positions that can't be reconciled. That's what makes them contradictory. And the forces that make them contradictory, again, cannot be avoided. They're at the heart of the capitalistic system, and they're not under anyone's control. They will work themselves out. So, but that is only true if the dialectical framework is actually part of reality. Because my point in class was that, again, Marx's position that politics has been exploitative, will disappear, and eventually, as an activity of the human race, politics will evaporate. That's another way of confirming the basic presumption that human beings are not political. They don't need politics. If they get the economic and institutional stuff, the economic and technological and productive stuff right, they won't need political institutions or political activities. The common good will automatically emerge from the configuration of the human race. But that, again, is a confirmation that politics isn't natural to the human being, and it can be reshaped decisively over history, and that politics in one age can become a radically new kind of being. That's the part that Marx shares with Hegel and Rousseau. So on one level, this is part of an old question. Is the human condition naturally political? And if so, then it's not beyond the power of politics to shape the destiny of even capitalistic society, because it's one thing to say that the tensions within society, the capitalistic economy, are uncontrollable, contradictory, and it cannot be overcome. But if politics is the master art of governing the human condition, and even in the 21st and 23rd century, politics may have a potency to render the tensions within capitalism manageable and produce a kind of a workable society, because no Western society is purely socialistic or capitalistic, and most of Western society inclines towards a political moderation of the tensions between capital and labor in the form of the moderated welfare state. So if Marx is right, capitalism can't be saved by politics, because politics can't save anything, and the economic system is doomed. But if Marx is wrong, if the dialectic is not an iron law of history, if it's not actually, if it's a mistaken grasp of the human condition, then Marx may have underestimated the power of the political system to preserve the vitality of the essence of capitalism while moderating it according to principles other than just private property. But that, again, leads to the larger question of is Marx's overall system predictive of the unfolding of capitalism? And there, I think I covered that sufficiently in class to say there are two opinions on that, yes and no. And the one opinion is and that's where I've been going with these comments about the dialectic, is that Marx never got it right. His framework is not a useful framework for analyzing economics and society. It may have had a moral appeal because it's grounded in a kind of a radical equality, and therefore, as I've said from the beginning of the course, these two thinkers, Marx and Nietzsche, kind of represent the twin elements of the modern establishment of human identity, is equality and freedom. It's not unpredictable that these two thinkers would represent in some ways the final stages of modern thought, where Marx's primary appeal is that it will radically equalize the human condition. Everyone in the world will have the same amount of political power, the same amount of social power, and therefore the promise of equality, which may have been a dim promise of original nature in early modern thought. Marx argues, well, the task is to completely reshape human nature and society so that it is absolutely describable by the term equality. But again, the version of capitalistic equality or inequality that we live with is essentially a Lockean version. So on one level, the great question for us as a nation and for Western society is whether the economic tensions within a Lockean system of private property under the rule of law can be managed by the political process. Here, it seems to me that this is where we just confront one of the great premises of modern thought. And so the future of modern politics may actually depend upon this great question of the political character of humanity. Now, let me just finish up with another element of the scientific character of Marx's economic system, which he presents essentially in Capital, and that is the labor theory of value. Marx thought that he had made a critical economic scientific discovery, corresponding in some ways to the periodical table of elements, which almost any modern chemist in science today would say that the periodic table of elements is why it may not capture every aspect of physical reality. Nevertheless, we now know that that table, that framework, is necessary for describing atomic and chemical processes, and that in that sense it's scientific. So the question is, what did Marx think that he had discovered in the labor theory of value, and how does that contribute to his diagnosis of the contradictory character of capitalism? The labor theory of value, which we saw in some ways is a Lockean concept in origins, says, and this is, by the way, this was a great problem faced by what are called the political economists, Adam Smith, Ricardo, and of Marx's generation. One of the things they struggled with is, why do commodities have value? And what establishes that value? And is it objective? And this is what Marx thought that he thought he found the molecule of labor value, and that therefore you could scientifically calculate how much the value of the product added by the labor of the worker. And therefore, here's what you could say. You can follow scientifically the whole generation of value in the labor of the worker and show that the interest of the bourgeois capitalist is profit in his property, in the productive property of capital. And therefore, it comes down to this for Marx. If there's some stage of the productive process which doesn't add to the intrinsic value of a commodity beyond what the labor, the work of the labor put in it, then it is either false or it's stolen. And therefore, for Marx, since the only source of real value in a commodity is the labor that's put into it, and he believes he can erect a system to measure and follow that labor through its process, then by definition, capitalism is a contradiction, where the profit of the capitalist is taken from, stolen from the value of the commodity established by the worker. So the capitalist adds nothing to the value of a commodity, according to Marx. And this is in some ways what he claimed to be his great insight in Capital, and you'd have to say that that this is the basis of his prediction of the inescapability of the contradictory economics of capital, because a system produces economic value in all of its commodities, and if it's based upon a lie, or it's based upon a kind of a shifting of value stolen from the workers' labor and converted into profit, that you can't have more of one and less of another. And that's why Marx predicted the necessary dynamics of capital unfolding would mean the immiseration or the impoverishment of the proletariat, because his argument was, over time the capitalistic system cannot keep. It's like a Ponzi scheme, or where you keep on stealing value from its original sources and falsely adding it onto it at the end. So Marx argued, given that capitalism and the ownership of the private ownership of the means of production added no economic value to the productive system, it must collapse, because eventually you will run out of labor value to steal from the proletariat. And eventually capitalism will be so concentrated, and the working class so poor, with their labor actually completely, I should say, the final products of society, which everyone enjoys, will be so robbed of the labor content that the working class eventually in capitalism will be reduced to a starving mass, and revolution will be unavoidable. So on one level, not only does this prediction rest upon the reliability of the dialectic as a framework, which we've already talked about, the problem with Marx's theory of value, the unit labor of value, is that it's pseudoscience. In some ways it doesn't. The analogy to atoms and molecules in the periodic table doesn't hold. Marx, in essence, invented a unit to measure something that can't be measured. So this points back to a larger discussion within economics as to what establishes value of a product. And it turns out the consensus of most free market economists is you can't establish value. Yes, obviously toilet paper and food and high-priced cigarettes have some objective value. They mean something to people. But in essence, what the free market does, according to free market theorists, is it modulates price by locating what consumers are pursuing in terms of commodities. That is to say, the labor which any particular product has depends not upon how much labor you put into it, but how marketable it is. That's what determines value and price. So in some ways, the critique of Marx on this question is that his economic foundations are not scientific. It's an imaginary concept which actually does not measure and therefore cannot characterize reality. So it adds a kind of a false precision and predictability, because the essential processes in the economic process are not essentially based upon the objective amount of labor put into a quantity. That seems to be part of Marx's framework, but whether or not it's part of the true framework. And then that gets us back to the main question. It turns out that all kinds of things in a free market contribute value to a product. And moreover, it turns out where Marx was wrong is that the technological revolution of new means of production doesn't restrict wage reimbursement to a growingly and increasingly poor, larger working class. In reality, the history of the working classes in the West, both in the more British and American systems, but also in the continental labor systems, is the general standard of the working class has improved dramatically in Western society. Now, again, this goes back to our fundamental question. That may be true, and Marx may still be essentially right in his core framework and his prediction about the future of capitalism and its unfolding. The one argument is that it simply capitalism hasn't matured to the point where its internal processes have been revealed fully. And that's an internal debate within Marxist economics. And as I mentioned in class, there's a French economist, Thomas Piketty, who argues that Marx's analysis of capitalism is essentially correct, that capitalism will always lead to greater and greater inequality, and that the eventual impoverishment will be, in which case, by the way, you could say, when will we know if Marx's system is true? When it comes true. Now, to go back to their alternative, that it won't come true, can't come true, because it's basically based upon imaginary standards of both social rendering society and the conflicts in society intelligible, that the dialectic framework is not true. It doesn't add any greater truth or intelligibility to understanding the system and the liabilities of the labor theory of value. So on one level, who's right? Will history prove to be as Marx suggested it? Again, it may be that Marx's political and economic ideas have influenced more moral authority because of the claims of fairness and redistribution than on its actual scientific ability to predict the future of a capitalistic economy. So, one last reflection on Marx and the notes from yesterday. So Marx presents the same complex irony that all the thinkers we've examined, because beginning with Machiavelli, with fortune and virtue, and Descartes with nature and science, and etc., our thinkers generally put forth a natural world in which there is no it is matter in motion, and there is no principle of freedom in the world as we understand it, and that interestingly enough, they offer a world in which human beings are completely the puppets of natural or chance forces, yet, as we saw in chapter 25 of Machiavelli and in Descartes' understanding of the power of science to transform and master nature, to the political schemes of Locke and Rousseau, etc. You could say that all of these thinkers posit a human universe in which human beings are essentially the puppets or products of larger cosmological or historical forces, yet all of these thinkers offer up a kind of a position of freedom to escape from your absolute determinism. That, I think, is a contradiction that modern thought never escapes, and in some ways is radicalized, as we'll see in Nietzsche. So how does the dream of individual freedom and the capacity to shape your world and master it play out in Nietzsche, our last thinker? First of all, as I said in class, Nietzsche, here's why why Professor sounds so brilliant. Nietzsche comes after Marx comes after Hegel comes after Rousseau. Brilliant. So in some ways, Hegel was the dominant figure in Western thought in the 1800s and 1900s. And what all thinkers, Marx and Nietzsche, and Heidegger for that matter, and contemporary 20th century thinkers agree on is that man is a historical being whose being is shaped by historical unfolding. Now, what the thinker sees in history and what it's playing out is unique to each thinker. Again, Hegel thought that his philosophy was the culmination of histories and the human search for philosophic identity. Marx thought that history was the unfolding of economic oppression and the unfolding of the dialectic. So Nietzsche, too, claims to be at the end of history, but of course claims to see something quite different than what his predecessors saw. So, like his predecessors, Nietzsche claims that history is now over. The historical process has ended. Well, what was the historical process for Nietzsche? And you'll see all of history was in some ways humanity struggling with and attempting to play out its most profound delusion. So in a way, history is a process of sifting out the truth for Nietzsche. But what is the delusion that humanity has struggled with and has led to historically different societies? And what is the insight that historical process, now completed, reveals for Nietzsche? And the primary falsehood of humanity in history and philosophy and religion and politics was to project an imaginary reality onto the world and to see God or nature. So on one level, history, just like for Hegel and Marx, is a series of incomplete and false cultures coming into being and passing away, but never quite confronting the true essence of the human condition, that that all objective truth, all human reliance, political, cultural, and personal reliance on objective truth, is an illusion. For Nietzsche, we now know that as a fact at the end of history. Part of what proves this is his and Marx's reliance upon Cartesian science. And so in some ways, Nietzsche and Marx accept a universe in which scientific laws completely based on the behavior of material, that there's no non-material aspect of existence, that the fact that we can now go to the moon and watch videos in space shows that that the modern cosmologists were right. So nature has no permanent or fixed meaning except insofar as human technology or thought manipulates it. So according to Nietzsche, all of the possible cultural and political alternatives have been examined and found to be wanting. And in the Zarathustra selection, that's the selection that the 1001 goals. In a way, and that's what Nietzsche thinks has been the story of humanity up till now. Human beings have tried to objectify their internal essence and project it onto the world as an external standard and authority, whether it's the nature of Aristotle or the theism of the Bible or other religions. So what the process of history now reveals is that history, the universe, has no purpose in it, no value, no support for human identity or community. The universe is dominated by forces and dynamics that are completely unintelligible to human beings and do not support our life in the universe. We are like castaways on a chaotic universe. So all of history up till now has been the search for cultural or objective values. And every human culture has in some ways picked some human quality and then turned it into gods that they bow down in front of. And that's the very graphic image of Nietzsche in the 1001 Goals. And that's why Nietzsche is also in some ways not only a historical relativist, but a cultural relativist. His argument is all human beings are the products of their culture, not just accidentally, like Americans eat bad food and wear blue jeans because it's our task as a modern nation, but rather human beings are decisively, and their minds are decisively stationed at a certain culture and a certain history, and therefore there's no such thing as transcendent truth. Now, ironically, just like Marx and Hegel, Nietzsche also says that the only exception to the idea there's no objective truth is my truth. That is to say, Nietzsche thinks that the final insight, in the same way that for Marx, the final class struggle, the ideological struggles between bourgeois and proletarians are like any other historical struggle, except it's the last one, because that class struggle reveals the essence of reality. So for Nietzsche, knowing what he now knows, that the reliance upon culture and a group experience of projecting the universe onto the universe is now untenable. Whatever future culture is, Nietzsche says, it can't be based on that illusion. That's gone. And that's, of course, God is dead. So Nietzsche's task for the West, for modern human beings, is to create a new kind of human existence in a universe without a God or an external authority, which means in some ways human being has to shift from the cultural level to now the individual level. And that's exactly what Nietzsche thinks his role has been, to provide the philosophic awareness to show that all value, all aspects of human identity are completely invented by human beings, masked by cultural invention in the past, but now liberated by the truth, so that now not groups of human beings, but individual human beings can now come forward and with this insight now recreate themselves as new beings based upon unfettered human creativity and freedom. So Marx, just like Nietzsche, just like Marx, has a kind of a apocalyptic view to the end of the modern West, and he sees two possibilities given where we are in history and what might be. One is to continue, and that's why you could say there are three kinds of human beings in Nietzsche. the man who has been cultural and bearing collective standard and objectivized standards up till now, the last man and the overman, der Übermensch, the Superman, which our translator Walter Kaufmann thought that, unfortunately, the phrase Superman had been polluted by endless decades and centuries of bad Marvel movies. So, at any rate, what's facing humanity for Nietzsche? Well, the last great delusion of humanity, Marx, and the radical egalitarianism and reshaping of the human condition in terms of the universal commodification of the human race. This is what Nietzsche means by the last man. And it's, by the way, it's obviously a corrupted and degraded form of humanity. And so on one level, Nietzsche thinks that one possibility, and probably the possibility for most human beings, is the universal democratic modern culture of slavishness to the people and to public opinion and to the scientific socialist trough. Nietzsche was critical of Marx in that he says, oh, everyone's going to be a producer and a creative artist at the end. No, what Marx is promising is the universal trough, and everybody will have an equally full belly and an equally active erogenous system, all trivialized and privatized by the growing administrative structure of the modern state and by the increasingly trivial pleasures of the masses of humanity. And so, on one level, I think he thinks that's where most of us are headed from, and that's what politics is headed for. Then the other possibility is the overman, a new humanity creating and recreating itself as individual value creators. And that's why Nietzsche's thought, as his life moves on, says you've got to set aside the own moral distinction between good and bad, good and evil. And now, good is whatever the freely liberated individual wills good into being for him or herself. So these two, and that's the next step in human evolution for Nietzsche. So what Nietzsche envisions is probably the more likely human world of a drab and dull, trivialized, and provident universal socialist society where people's minds are ruled by shifts in public opinion and social media. I think you got something right there. And that in that wasteland, a few creative individuals will go forth, paying no attention to the masses and their triviality and their tyranny. So in a way, Nietzsche still wants life to have thrust and meaning. Nietzsche still wants life to have joy and challenge. And in some ways, making sure that everyone's bucket is equally full. Nietzsche doesn't think that exhausts the possibility of human freedom and joy. And so in a world that doesn't support joy, and in a world that historically seems to produce the antithesis to joy, which is kind of a dull, sedated, physically universe. By the way, probably the best example of what Nietzsche might have thought the last man and the last society looked like was A Brave New World, in which every human being is happy, but of course reduced to every trivial physical need, superintended by a complete scientific administrative state. So Nietzsche sees that's death of humanity. They may have a full belly, but they have an empty head. So on one level, the next great possibility is people like Nietzsche, the few people in the individual who will set aside, who will not operate within society's low moralism, and will in some ways go on to create new human life, finally liberated from the great illusion that has dominated human life until this time. So on one level, you could say, how true is this for Nietzsche? Well, part of it is in his early writings when he kind of established the decisive stamp of his thought. He came to see, in his early works, he came to have an appreciation for Greek tragedy. That in some ways, human life is destined. There's no way to escape a tragic fate in the universe because the universe is not a nice place. It's an empty abyss. And therefore, whatever meaning a human life has, now liberated from the tyranny of cultural and religious determination, a new kind of human liberty will come into the being made. So in some ways, Nietzsche promises a happy ending to a sad story, just like the other thinkers that we have read. Only for Nietzsche, the happiness comes from the awareness that there's no escape from this universe, and that all you can do is kind of whistle your own tune in the dark. So, but that's still a happy ending for Nietzsche. It is a gay science, fröhliche Wissenschaft. It's the joyful philosophy. So, on one level, you have to say, well, is that great Nietzschean premise true? But that Nietzschean premise that the world is dark, there is no God, and there's no objective sources for human identity and community. Don't forget, that's not original to Nietzsche. That is a common thread of assumption that goes throughout all these modern thinkers. Now, to articulate that question, the interested person has to go beyond the framework of modern thought and examine the world as it looked to the ancients. I'm not saying that ancient political philosophy is true, because there is this difficult cosmological question that we live in. But all I can say is at the end of the journey, it turns out that everything can be questioned, even the dogmatic atheism of modern philosophy. So let's just say that Nietzsche ends with the same tension that all the other thinkers have, including Marx. Man is not free, but yet we will our own freedom into existence. The world is dark and meaningless, but we have the possibility to ignore that and kind of assert through the power of our own wills this divine power over our own lives. Now, so again, you're left with this confused and complex question. Does modernity deny to human freedom in the universe and then offer to humanity a kind of a utopian or unhinged freedom because it can't find any basis for that freedom in the cosmology? Again, the answer to that is, I think, not settled. So, on one level, this is why Nietzsche was so concerned about culture and art, because he thought that one possibility of the surviving of human integrity and creativity to the future was a series of artists that could produce remarkable art based upon Nietzschean premises. That Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which is Zarathustra coming down from the mountain to offer a new kind of human life for humanity, that Nietzsche is the great provider of that future, cleared from all the illusions in the past. And you can ask yourself, would I prefer to be? It's sort of like Jack's father in Crimes and Misdemeanors. Would you prefer to live under a delusion and have a happy life, or would you prefer an unhappy life guided by truth, tragedy, and self-creation? Well, what does the future hold in store for us? Where do we go from here? Will science turn out to be the universal liberator as it generates a divine mastery over the human process around us? Do any of you think that the same being that generated the atomic bomb and can now manipulate human genetics, how do you think it will work out for humanity to have divine power over the universe and itself, at the same time that it admits there's no moral standards for the use of that power? Will we face chaos and nihilism as Western liberalism eats itself up in the self-critical dialectic that Cropsey talks about, and that I think we've seen to some degree work out in these thinkers? Will there be some political and cosmological alternative principle that humanity can turn to, such as a revivified national religious tradition? There's no question that certain versions of ancient religion seem to be vibrant and modern. Now, whether or not they can produce governing models in the universe, whether or not radicalized Islam or Hinduism, etc., is not clear. But what would a return to ancient foundations look like? Well, first of all, it would mean taking the first sequence in this two-sequence course of ancient and modern philosophy. So that's your next step. But the real step for humanity is, if all the principles available by the modern thinkers who have reshaped and directed the human world in this vast project of unification and liberalization, or liberating, it may be that the social and political and economic structures of humanity will be guided by some kind of derivative Marxism and Lockeanism, and some kind of tense contribution, in which the political masses struggle not to be controlled by technological elites wielding bureaucratic power. What a return to ancient foundations would probably mean not that you would have something that looked like Plato's Republic or even Athens, but rather you would have groups of human beings united by a common study of the enduring human problems. in which the presumption is not that the dogmatism of the moderns regarding liberty, freedom, and a dark universe is necessarily the final answer for humanity, in which case the task of this course never ends and is to be completed in all of our individual and collective lives as we pursue the truth of the human condition in an interesting universe.